Endgames is a series of monthly comradely conversations exploring crucial aspects of eco-socialism today. And today is the first of two events which will look at housing organising and the climate crisis.
Let's start with the housing crisis, the housing question in general. I'll try not to speak for too long, sort of 15, 20 minutes, but I'm going to be hitting you with a few stats right at the start about, yeah, just how bad housing is here in Britain. For those of you who joined based somewhere else, this might be news. I think for a lot of the comrades who are here in Britain today, this might be sort of figures that you may have heard before or know. The average house price has reached the highest since records began, as it were. It's £270,000 now to buy a house in Britain across it. And in London, the major city, it's now £500,000 on average to just buy one house. At the close of 2019, even when homes were being sold, about a fifth, well, just under a fifth of them were being sold by landlords to rent to people. So not even for owner occupation, which has created this kind of system where even where houses are being built, the price is being pushed up higher and higher by this quite vocal and intense minority of landlords who are interacting with the British housing system. As a result, rent is at a 13-year high. It's about £1,064 per month across Britain. And again, in London, it's £1,760 per month. For many people, for the average wage, it's between 30 and 40% of their wage that they're now spending if they're living in a city just on rent, which prevents them from saving up to buy a deposit and prevents them buying a house, and is slowly pushing the housing system into Britain into a sort of two-tier system where there are a set of owner occupiers and there are people who are trapped in a rent system. Outside of just rent and the actual just lack of housing stock, there's obviously the most intense forms of homelessness, in particular people who are living on the street or in cars or in any other situation like that. The big issue recently estimated that it's between 0.5 to 1% of households across Britain who are facing that kind of living condition. That's households, so that's not just the population. That might be one person, that might be four people, it might be more. And that's historically a figure that's underreported due to the many forms of homelessness, the ways in which councils attempt to not interact with it, and all these kinds of things. What we have in general, outside of these stats, is we have a declining stock, as it were, in terms of its quality and its amount. So we have less and less homes being built that are actually affordable for people. Over the homes that are able to be bought or that people are renting from, they've not been repaired, worked on, or had anything done with them for many, many years. So they're often, for example, as we've seen with the recent cost of living crisis, people are choosing between heating their homes or their rent because their homes have not had any sort of insulation or heating system repair for the last sort of 20, 30 years. On top of this, the housing system in Britain is basically relies on predatory passive income, as these sort of landlord characters call it, practices, where increasingly people are engaged in landlordism as a way to make a quick amount of money, and there's an increasing divide between. And as a result, a lot of people would characterize Britain's sort of political economy as an owner-based democracy, i.e., most government decision making, most of the sort of ways in which the government is thinking about issues like poverty, issues like the climate crisis, presuppose that you are the owner of a house, which creates a very serious issue in terms of participation in working class people who are in rental properties. A classic example of this is the pandemic. In the pandemic, owners were given a mortgage freeze, which has then allowed them to accumulate more and more money and therefore buy second or third buy-to-let properties, whilst tenants were still owing rent to their landlords with just an extension on the amount of time before an eviction. So the assumption there being that the interests of mortgage payers is way more important than the interests of working class renters in Britain. Outside of Britain, if we look globally, nearly every major city globally is dealing with some combination of housing shortages, where there is a lot of construction, it's creating sort of systems of sprawl and pollution and other infrastructural difficulties related to I guess what Mike Davies would call planet of the slums, the sort of increased focus on urban cities as being the only place where we can work, and therefore increasingly forcing people having to live in cities under capitalism, and creating a whole host of ecological issues there, but also social issues. 900, the World Resources Institute and Bloomberg Cities Lab, neither of which are necessarily massive criticizers of capitalism, right? Have these estimates that it's around 900 million people living in what can be classified as slums globally. And by 2025, they reckon that 1.6 billion people will suffer from a lack of secure, adequate, and affordable housing across the globe. This is a crisis of ludicrous proportions, where the ability to be housed and to meet your needs met with housing is a major divider in terms of the difference between the global working class and the capitalist class. And how does this sort of housing system, bad as it is, relate to climate breakdown? Well, buildings account for around 36% of energy use globally, and 39% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions globally, according to the UN Environment Programme. Carbon emissions from buildings are expected to double by 2050 without major action. Currently, the industry of construction and building providers are improving their efficiency in terms of these things at a 1.5% per year reduction, which is completely outweighed by the massive number of buildings that is being built at the same time, right? So this tiny reduction that they are successfully doing is completely outweighed by the rise in property development as sort of a way in which capitalism fixes its money. Basically, we're a system where the current stock globally is inadequate to meet human need, as we've just shown, and also withstand climate events. We're not building infrastructure that can deal with flooding, that can deal with storms, that can deal with many of the effects of climate change. Where we are building, we're building with a massively carbon intensive emission system. And we're not building in terms of thinking buildings as a long life project that are meant to stand for decades and decades and decades and use a minimal efficient amount of energy. We're talking about quick, cheap builds that can basically satisfy the interests of property developers and major shareholders. And let's look at this, let's bring this down to earth. I know I've just bombarded you with stats, so let's think. Today in Britain, we just were inundated with Storm Eunice and Franklin. And whilst the sort of red alert hit everyone on Friday, and a lot of people now feel like maybe it wasn't as bad as initially those sort of reports that were saying you had to stay at home were, over 1 million homes lost power on Friday in Britain, 450,000 of which continued into the next 24 hours. So there are tens of thousands of homes right now that are still not, that still don't have power because of this storm. Thousands of homes were damaged by wind, trees, and there's now flooding, flash flooding occurring across the country, from the River Calder to the Mersey to a whole host of other places. These two images are a pretty good example of the sort of thing when we say that climate events intersect with the bad quality of housing. So we have here on the left one of the houses that the wind basically ripped the front of the building off here. And that's because it's cheap housing that's not been repaired, that's not been taken care of, because it's not in the interest of the capitalist class to provide good housing, that after a few bits of wind doesn't lose the whole front of the house. And to the right here, this image is from Shropshire. I think this is another great example where you've got these sort of lovely historic buildings in the high street right next to the river, and the only thing stopping all that water coming in and destroying those buildings are those temporary barriers. That is a terrifying situation that just shows how badly prepared we are here in Britain for climate events, and how badly our housing stock is unable to cope when extreme weather events from climate change come along. The fact that all we have is hoping that we get enough of notice from the Met to erect temporary barriers to stop water flooding into people's homes and the places that they eat and they buy and they shop from. It's actually something that's sort of an unspoken crisis, I think. And again, it's always the folks at the sharp end of the housing crisis that are experiencing some of the worst impacts. I'm an organizer in tenants' unions in London, and today hundreds were flooded in Milford Tower, which is a social housing block in Lewisham. There's videos of it online if you do want to try and find out. Basically, water flooding from up and down the building from both old pipes and it coming into the building drainage system. People being unable to turn on their electrics, being unable to do anything in the house. The council and the provider of the social housing block, even by midday, had not responded or replied to these predominantly working class, predominantly people of colour, residents of this Lewisham block. They had to get the fire brigade out to even begin to basically do this. And this is the second time this has happened in 2 years, right? It's getting worse and worse is the best encapsulation of what this means. We have a classic example of working class people who, no fault of their own, after having a storm where they're told to stay home, are suddenly waking up to find water flooding into their homes. And not only are they finding that, it's the second bloody time it's happened in 2 years. It's an absolutely disgusting crisis that is happening in this country. And I think this is just a really good example that shows it's social housing, it's these poorly taken care of blocks within cities that are already facing massive drives from renters that are facing the real sharp end of the climate crisis. And so let's go back, a bit of socialist history here. Engels is The Housing Question, which is a short pamphlet he wrote in 1872. And I think this is a real, a beautiful piece that Engels has written. So apologies, it's a lot of text, but modern natural science has proved that the so-called poor districts in which workers are crowded together are the breeding places of all those epidemics which from time to time afflict our towns. Cholera, typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox, and other ravaging diseases spread their germs in the pestilential air and the poisoned water of these working class quarters. In these districts, the germs hardly ever die out completely, and as soon as circumstances permit it, they develop into epidemics and then spread beyond their breeding places, also into the more airy and healthy parts of the town inhabited by the capitalists. Capitalist rule cannot allow itself the pleasure of creating epidemic diseases among the working class with impunity. The consequences fall back on it, and the angel of death rages in its ranks as ruthlessly as in the ranks of the workers. This is a perfect encapsulation in 1872 of how crises like COVID, like climate change, come and they absolutely just wreak havoc. And the core point at which they are starting time and time again is the working class areas of cities that we've seen, whether it's the spreading of diseases like COVID, which predominantly happened when working class people were forced to go into workplaces without protection, without adequate sick pay, and then were forced back into their communities in cramped houses to spread that disease amongst themselves, or whether it's flooding and flood infrastructure and flooding waters breaking into homes, and then all of a sudden the whole flood infrastructure of a town breaks down because there's been this massive weak point of social housing blocks that have not been taken care of and the like. This is perfectly encapsulated when you look at cities and housing and you understand it from a class perspective. I think it's a really important and amazing thing that Engels in 1872 can create this absolutely on the ball description of a pandemic that happens in 2020s entirely based on just understanding housing and the housing system as a class-based system. Now, this is from an article I wrote a few months back about flooding and the housing system within Britain. This is kind of in response to what we see when we see floods come in, when we see storms come in, when people suddenly see these massive housing blocks or wherever dealing with a lack of heating or dealing with flood water in their home or dealing with some effect from extreme weather. People love to say, well, lovely community spirit. They love to take photos and say the sob stories about mutual aid and people coming together to take care of themselves, as they did again with COVID-19 and the mutual aid discussion that happened right at the start of the pandemic, if you can remember the heady days of March 2020. I think this is a really important sort of core point here is, as the state retreats from seriously funding flood defences and the obligation is put on households to place the organisational burden solely on emergent forms of community mutual aid from those living in and around flooded areas, dampens organisational potential. with people across Britain struggling already with the gutting of social services and worsening living conditions, why should it be their responsibility to mount the defence against flooding? Why should it be the responsibility of folks and working class people in this country who live in already horrific housing conditions, who have 30-40% of their income taken by a landlord each month, who have no hope of really being able to afford their own home or being able to really deal with the long-term issues in and around housing and climate change, to prepare for these kind of events, to reduce the emissions, to pay for the insulation, to do all these things? The burden for the transition on climate has to be on those that have profited inordinately from the amount of property development and predatory landlordism and the horrific system that we have created. But at the moment, we have the entirely opposite. It's working class people that are absolutely shouldering the burden of the climate crisis and the housing crisis as they intersect. And this is really frustrating. A lot of people say that the amount of houses that need to be built and similar, that there's just too much housing, there's just too much population, they retreat into all these kinds of lines, there's not money everywhere. George Eustace, when the 2019 floods happened in November, said that we just can't protect everyone from flooding. He stood in front of the cameras and said, listen, we've just got to get used to the fact that with climate change, we can't protect everyone from flooding. Yet the scientists at his own Committee on Climate Change, in their climate risk assessment in Britain, had this really simple thing to say. The UK has the capacity and the resources to respond effectively to these risks, yet it has not done so. There has been a conscious choice to allow working class people to live in horrific housing conditions and to therefore feel cold weather when they've got no heating, to feel floodwater at their door when the storm's coming in, to lose power when the wind knocks down the power lines, to face trees that have not been taken care of falling onto their buildings. It's just a disaster of man-made proportions, and it's shocking, I think, how little that it's actually kind of recognised until there's flooding every year. And because it happens every year now, we've got flooding again in February in Yorkshire. People kind of treat it as, well, it always does this. We would not have the cities, the locations, the areas we had if they flooded this regularly. It's not normal that we're getting over 100-mile-an-hour winds hitting us in this country. It's not normal that hundreds of thousands of homes this weekend lost power. So, sorry. And I think this is the really important thing that I kind of want to end on and I want people to take away, which is that there's lots of environmentalists and researchers and wonderful people who work on cities and urban environments and housings, building emissions and how to do green housing. They do a lot of policy work on these issues. There's a lot of really amazing technical research that goes into how do you improve building efficiency, how do you reduce the amount of resources that's being used, etc., etc., etc. But few are actually attempting to talk about organising the power to challenge both systems, the nasty housing system and the way that that's been working to attack working class people, and the way in which the housing system is contributing and weak in response to the climate crisis. I can think of a few examples that are just starting in recent years, and I do want to end on that as kind of a point of hope. We've seen Insulated Britain come up across the countries and basically initially starting with massive opposition, with so much anger that they were blocking roads, people assaulting them, people threatening to run them over and to do all these things. Yet in the face of that, they have been absolutely vindicated by the cost of living crisis. They've been absolutely vindicated by the horrific inability people have had to pay their heating bill and to pay their rent and other such costs over the last few months. And they were really a whistleblower on just how bad the system on housing and climate was this year, and how easy, again, it would be for the government to come in and fix these things. And then similarly, renters' unions, whether it's London Renters' Union, which I'm a member of, Acorn across the rest of England and Wales, I believe, and Live in Rent in Scotland and Catchu in the north of Ireland. All of these are coming together to organise renters so they can actually stand up to social housing providers, to landlords, and saying, look, you need to repair the building. We need to stop water coming in. I need actual insulation. I need damp not to be up the wall. I need to be able to afford my rent. all these kinds of things. What they're trying to do in very different ways, both in State Britain and the renters' unions, is to ask, how do we build the kind of disruptive power that exerts an influence over this hostile system and actually turns it around? And I think, just as a final note here, because I realize I've been speaking for a bit, I think eco-socialists, people who identify as eco-socialists, are some of the best folks to call the alarm, to actually lead on the organising here. We've got this real technical know-how. We've got loads on the left who've worked on things like construction, on the actual technical issues of green buildings, the urban environment, housing. In particular, geography departments across the country have been flying the Marxist flag for years, at the same time as they're putting out technical reports on how to provide green, affordable housing for everyone. But you combine that with a tradition of working class organising. It has been socialists across countries globally who've led in the fight against landlordism, who've led in the fight on organising renters and workers in their communities to deal with the lack of housing and to fight for it for everyone. So if we combine those two traditions, that technical know-how about the climate crisis and how to fix it in regard to housing, with a tradition and a recognition that the way we build this power, the way we move from just producing that policy to actually organising a movement that can fight back against this, is organising the working class as they are in the housing system.